Hello, good morning, Dave, and welcome to the Education Superheroes interview. It's really great to have you here. Dave Cormier is the learning specialist at the University of Windsor in Canada, and he's been really kind to join us today. Uh, I've been following Dave's work because I'm interested in rhizomatic education and community as curriculum, and I think he's been working on this for over a decade almost. And I'm sure that he'll be able to say some of the things and articulate some of the ideas in a really useful and purposeful manner for all of us to understand. And I think it's a really good time to be talking about this, especially with the pandemic and the new normal. I think the idea of rhizomatic education has a lot of currency at the moment. So my first question to you would be, for those who don't know about rhizomatic education, would you be able to give an elevator pitch to a national education board about rhizomatic curriculum?
Sure. Directed at a national education board?
Yeah.
Yeah, so as you say, I've been working on this for a dozen years or so. There are a bunch of different ways I can explain this. If I'm going to explain it to a national education board, I would suggest that it's a way of thinking about the education system from an internet first perspective, a digital first perspective. So for years, we've been in a situation of information scarcity, where the biggest goal of the education system was to find that precious information and bring that precious information to the people who didn't have it. And I mean, for 5,000 years in India, 5,000 years, we've been looking at that kind of process, right? Back to the Indus Valley, right? Like, information is rare. We have to go find it. We have to preserve it in very, very careful ways. And I'm going to dole it out to you as you come into our educational institutions. Well, for the last 20 years, that has been increasingly untrue. And I would say at this point, as long as you have access to the internet, it is definitely not true. And that would be really the only barrier to information at this point. The problem is an abundance of information. The problem is how you navigate it. The problem is how you map your way through that information. The problem is how you confront uncertainty. If our education system is built the way it's traditionally been, where the teacher decides what the student needs to know, and then the student plays the game of school where they try to figure out what the teacher wants, and then the teacher gives them a test and holds the answers away, and then the students have to guess what they're figure out what the answers are and give it back to the teacher. Basically, you're teaching obedience. You're in a command and control structure where you're teaching students that there's one true thing, and their job as a learner is to find out what that one true thing is. Now, as a colleague of mine from India taught me in 2008, as a white Canadian middle class man, there's all kinds of stuff about the world I don't understand. And my perspective on how one thing works or another thing works is contained by the culture that I'm in. None of the things that we do that are important are single answer questions. None of them are about finding out what the secret knowledge is, because right now we live in a global society. We have all these intersecting cultures. We have competing interests. We have the rise of fascism that's coming up all around us. And fascism is exactly that, right? There is one answer. I'm going to go find a powerful person and I'm going to listen to that person. Rhizomatic education is set against that. So in a rhizomatic model, the student is the true center of the learning process and is their map of their way through the information landscape that we're here as teachers to help guide, inform, instruct. But in a rhizomatic classroom, I don't necessarily know what my students are going to learn. I've seen starting classes with a syllabus, but an empty curriculum, right? Where what I'm trying to do is create an ecosystem in which students can learn, where I might bring in pieces of my own experience, but the goal is not for them to become like me. The goal is to get better at being them, right? Yeah. And what I'm trying to do is help guide them through that process so that they can navigate their way through that information abundance in a way that develops that skill that they actually need now, which is not remembering or being obedient, but rather learning how to tell good stuff from bad stuff, learning how to tell information that's better, not necessarily best, but better than another, and then combining those in ways that are useful. So a rhizomatic model, it comes from that idea of, if you think of the weeds in your garden and the way that they don't spread in straight lines. They go to the places that are more useful. And a good gardener keeps them out of the bad places and helps them go in directions that help them grow better. But if you ever planted mint anywhere in the ground, you will know that you can't really control it. And I mean, that's the downside as an educator, is that you don't know what your students are going to study necessarily. You may tell them, look, I can tell you that this piece is not going to be helpful for you. You might try this, you might try this, try looking at something else, but you're going to be surprised and you're not going to know.
Yes.
And so that whole approach shifts the starting point of the process, particularly as an educator, from I spend the 6 months before my class starts deciding what my students need to know, to I meet my students and then I learn who they are, and then I help them grow in the direction they're trying to grow.
The first time I encountered rhizomatic education, it was with the metaphor of the ginger, of learning sprouting wherever they get, or wherever it does, because you can't really control it. And from the way you explained it, it's completely non-linear. It's not a top-down approach, not just from teacher to student, but also from board of studies to teacher.
Yeah.
So our first experiment with a rhizomatic model was when we tried to build a journalism curriculum, an English for journalism curriculum at the university in India. And it was a journalism school with postgraduate students. So it was a really exciting experiment. And what we did is, like you said, we just laid out the skills that they would require for the industry at the beginning of the year. And we let the students play around with those skills and change it as we went along. But the content of each class, that would change. And the teachers from other departments could come onto this blog curriculum that we built and recommend reading for that skill to be developed. So that was something that we experimented with back in 2016, if I'm not wrong.
So what challenges did you run into? Because you got to tell me there were challenges. There's always challenges.
Yes, definitely. When we were thinking about it, it was innovative, and we were really excited about this whole thing to lift off, and for everyone from different universities to start using this and plugging in content for each of these different skills. And we did an entire road trip where we went to different universities and media houses in India, and we presented the curriculum. We talked about it. There was momentum when we were talking about it. But the moment we left, I don't think anyone really engaged, and the content never really evolved the way we imagined it would. So it's really more about the community using it. And at a point, depending on the number of people in that community, the chances of it becoming rhizomatic and the students following different parts of education is a possibility, but it's still conceptual in terms of that curriculum. And that's where we've started up a new attempt at rhizomatic education where I'm working. At SCORE campus, we're bringing out the greatest English classroom. And I think English is a subject where you can really explore rhizomatic curriculum because it's completely skills-based, and you can have different domains and students.
Content's basically irrelevant.
Exactly.
It's irrelevant.
So pursuing completely different things and following different paths to find their own version of the language that they need and how they want to use it in a communicative manner.
I started, my first teaching was in South Korea as a language teacher.
Wow. Okay.
So yeah, no, I totally understand what you're saying. And frankly, I think that informed some of the sort of my thoughts around the matter, is that at the end of the day, and English is such a ridiculous language anyway. It's not like studying a language with actual rules. Yeah. If you're studying French or, South Korean, or Korean, I suppose I should say, there are specific rules you just need to accept. If you're speaking English, I mean, what the Brits are going to say about what the rules are and what the Americans are going to say can be totally different anyway. Yeah. So there's no amount of rule-based structure that's going to help you with the language. And I do think that certain topics are better served by journalism. Again, it's a great one. I would encourage you in the belief that I see your project as a perfectly rhizomatic example of the stuff we were doing. So it seems that you're kind of part of and I had no idea you were doing it. Right. Yeah. And I think it's the same with any of the stuff you put out there on the open web, is that it's entirely possible you did actually encourage someone else to do it, but nobody ever comes back to tell you. Exactly. Or almost never. So I think the thing about a traditional curriculum approach, and just to encourage you in the work that you're doing, when you take a top-down bureaucratic approach to curriculum and you say, this is true, it's much easier to spread around because you've taken the responsibility away from the educators themselves, right? Yeah. And that's, I would say, sad, but it is much more effective. So if you're going to take a rhizomatic approach and you say, here's this thing, you can do whatever you want, that's always the problem. because nobody wants to do whatever they want. People want to, not because you can't coach them to get there, but it's funny, I was talking to to a colleague about this the other day. There's a deconstruction process that needs to happen at the front end, where when you say to a student, you can choose to do whatever you want. It's funny because I'm working with a bunch of students now, same thing. You say, you can do whatever you want. 97% of the people who say that don't really mean that. What they mean is, I'm tired of seeing the same thing over and over again. I want everything I want, but I want you to make it more interesting. Right? So they'll say, do a graphical representation of your project. And then you hand it in and they're like, well, I don't see the citations. And you're like, well, you never told me. You told me to do a graphical representation.
Yeah.
Well, I wanted you to do whatever you want, but I want you to obviously do this and this and this and this and this and this. So if you can take a rhizomatic approach, my experience is that it takes a long time to convince students that you're serious. That you actually legitimately mean that they're able to develop in their own way. And to take a journalism course, like thinking about that off the top of my head, the content of what they write about, sure, but even the way they write. So the difference between an effective blogger and an effective science journalist, totally different writing style. And at any given time, I refuse to believe that there's any instructor who knows, take blogging in particular, that kind of sort of journalism. There's no instructor who knows what writing style is going to appeal to what audience. I can speak to the audience that I know, and I can tell you what, middle-aged white men who are in higher education who are a bit weird are going to say. But that doesn't make me an authority over a million other groups that are out there, which is why the rhizomatic approach can work, because it allows for diversity.
Yeah, that's actually quite interesting that you said, you talked about authority, because if you take any field, not just journalism, not just English, but even the sciences, it's not hard and fast fact or truth. It's a matter of perspective. It's a matter of where you are, even medicine for that matter. It's not really hard science where you say, okay, this is the problem and this is the solution. There's an approach that you can take, and then that approach would lead you down a certain path, like in a rhizomatic structure.
Medicine is my favorite example, because every time I talk about rhizomatic learning, somebody says, I don't want my doctor to learn that way. Well, last year, I managed a medical school for a year.
Oh, wow.
And I can tell you right now, do you know how doctors learn? Rhizomatically. It's exactly what they freaking do. You go in Canada, you spend in a medical school in Canada, you spend 2 years in class, and that's partially in class and partially doing sort of like practical doctor practice things where they have like fake hospital rooms and whatever. But in year 3, you spend the whole year in the hospital following doctors around. Learning what? Doesn't matter. Follow the doctors around. See what they do. Do what they do. And then you go back for 4th year, and then you go out for residency for 2 years. And what do you do during residency? Just follow doctors around. Do what they do. What could be more rhizomatic than that? As you say, when you corner a doctor and you go, do you really know? They go, well, I mean, no.
It could be,
It could be. And they have these flow charts that they use where they say, oh, okay, you come in and you're limping. And I go, okay, what happened? Oh, I hurt my knee. And then they say, oh, can you bend your knee backwards so that your heel touches the back of your leg? And you'll go, oh no, my knee's really stiff when I try to do that. And they'll go, torn meniscus. So they have the flow charts that they use, which are kind of guesstimates to get you there, but they're not true. They're just shortcuts. Anyway, I agree with you.
I think I like an analogy that you used, and I watched this in one of your other videos. You said that it's like a garden and you need to let it be without boundaries and without restrictions, but you still need to build in an ecology and rope it in at some level so that there's some kind of structure to follow and some kind of end goal. And even if the learning outcome isn't immediate and doesn't happen at the end of the course or the end of the workshop, there needs to be some learning outcome at some moment in their life where they go back to that moment, that rhizomatic moment where some learning happened, and they can draw on that at a later stage. And that's what we're hoping to do with this approach of, rather than having a set curriculum, we workshop English classes and get experts from around the world to come in and present these workshops with minute microcosmic details of language, of creative writing, of drama, etc., all different forms in which English can be used. And then we hope that the students follow those paths into some kind of rhizomatic form of learning. And that's where, I want to talk a little bit about the community. The community that's involved in education. And it doesn't just have to be a teacher-student relationship. It can also definitely be industry experts. It can be your parents. It can be a lot of people informing what you do in your life. And I think networking skills for the new normal, it's very crucial. And I think the pandemic has really changed the way we look at education as being hard and fast, because when the pandemic hit, a lot of teachers around the world were trying to fit these linear models or linear curricula into virtual classrooms, and they didn't know what to do because the students were all over the place. So what's your take on that? How do you think teachers who are grappling with this can adopt new styles to get their students into a rhizomatic pattern of education and form a sense of community?
I'll start at the end and move my way back. So no, that's fine. That's no problem. In terms of people going with linear content, the first thing I would say to anybody who is an educator who's thinking about this is, if what you're doing responds to copy and paste, you've made a mistake, right? So from an internet perspective, what you have to understand is any question that's ever been printed or published anywhere, every student has the answer to that question. Every student right now has the teacher's copy of the textbook. Right? So you're wasting your time. If you're going to try to catch your students cheating or any of that stuff, you're fighting a war you're not going to win. Forget it. So I understand that you could do this in your little artificial cone of scarcity inside your classroom, but once you go to the internet, you can forget it. And frankly, 2 years ago, they were still getting all the answers to all the questions. You just didn't know it. So let's start there. In terms of the community being the curriculum, it's really about what the goal of the learning process is. So let's take your language example again, because it's an excellent one. What's the outcome that you're looking for? Well, you want somebody to be able to effectively communicate in English. Whatever effective means for them, you want them to be able to do it. Now, I'll give you an edge case example of a negative example. When I was in Korea, I met a magical human once, a South Korean man, who only spoke in idioms, literally only in idioms.
Wow.
But his idioms were from different cultures. So in speaking to him, you would understand some of the idioms, but there's no one person who could understand all of his idioms. There was no legitimate way to have a 5-minute conversation with the man. Like, one time we actually gathered around 3 or 4 people and tried to decipher them all as sort of like a bar game. But that is learning without a real goal in mind. Right? That's just learning language, learning English. And I mean, okay, if that's what you're looking for, but I think what most people are looking for is to be able to effectively communicate. And everybody's going to have a different outcome for that, hence where the rhizomatic thing works out. But the best way for people to get accustomed to effectively communicating is to have them communicate. And if you're the only person they're communicating with, then they're only learning one kind of way of doing that. If they're communicating with each other, if they're communicating online, if they're finding other experts, if they're listening to different people, if they're engaging in different ways, if they're trying to, it doesn't matter what they're doing. But what the outcome is that you're looking for is them to be able to effectively communicate. So then it makes sense to me for the process of effectively communicating to be part of the learning process, not let's try to do this for 4 years and then after we're done, we'll go out and effectively communicate, which I've seen in any number of cultures in their approaches to English language learning.
Right? Yes, and I was teaching in Japan just before I moved back to India during the pandemic.
You know exactly what I mean then.
Exactly, and the language school culture in Japan, it's still thriving, and language is still being taught in arbitrary bits, and they're never going to use it outside of that classroom space. And unfortunately, they just see the same teacher every day. And that's the extent of their communication. Like you said, I think if you really want to learn how to communicate in a language, not just English, any language, or if you really want your kids to start communicating, it's just give them opportunities or moments where they can actually communicate with human beings from around the world. So I completely agree with that.
Structured risk, not full risk. I mean, you still have to
Yes.
structure that risk, particularly when we're talking about kids.
Mhm.
But even with adults, you can't put them in terrible situations.
Exactly.
So it's not, certainly not suggesting, and this goes back to one of your earlier comments, I'm certainly not suggesting that there's no scaffolding that goes into this. Part of the design, part of that gardening that you were talking about is about making sure that that garden makes sense. You don't want people to be too far away from the things that they can understand. You want to be able to give people an on-ramp that allows them to join. But I mean, and the community thing is not restricted to language learning. I would say it's the same for math.
So we've talked a little bit about the Rhizomatic model and about community as curriculum. How does creativity and Rhizomatic and community-based education, how does it all fit together?
I'll give you a story of a project I partially successfully ran. It ran successfully for a while. And I mean, with any of this innovation stuff, if you can get it run successfully all the time, show me how.
Yeah.
But it was a challenge that I got given about re-envisioning computer science curriculum. And one, to make it more appealing to young women, also to make it more creative, because basically it was that 1990s version of a computer science curriculum where you sort of, look at the textbook, turn to page 65 and and so what we did is we used microcontrollers, which are little tiny little robot-y things, I guess you would call them, with sensors and stuff. And we created a curriculum where basically you steal code properly, like you cite it, you take code, and you build projects. So the first project is an elastic band launcher. The second project is a mini golf hole, if that resonates. But the third project, you can do whatever you want. Okay. So in these projects, neither the code nor the project you built is graded. Okay. The only things you grade are the project management. There's a whole project management tool they have to follow. It's really rigid. There's structure and all the rest of this stuff because I'm a firm believer in the value of project management. And on the other side, there's a reflection. There's a series of reflections for the students. So one of the things we discovered, for instance, is the noise in these classrooms is often really, really frustrating for people. So the first one's a reflection on interaction, cultural interaction or whatever. So you've got this really rigid project management piece you're measuring on this side. You've got this really kind of soft and fluffy personal reflection piece on this side, and you're grading those. But in the middle, the creativity is protected from the grade. Okay. So I don't care whether or not your elastic band launcher works. I will continuously try to help you to get it to work. I'll help you troubleshoot. We'll go through the process. We'll work on our resilience. We'll do all the rest of those things, but I'm not going to grade it. I'm not going to grade your coding because coding is basically stealing anyway. Come on. Everybody who codes steals code. So let's not let's not pretend that the vast majority of people are ever going to actually write code from scratch. It's ridiculous. But in those designs, what I want you to do is to have your creativity be free from my judgment. And I think that that's one of the core necessities for that kind of creativity, particularly with kids, is that you need to find spaces where their work is allowed to be emergent, where they're allowed to fail risk-free, right? Where they're allowed to follow that path. They're allowed to hear the rhizomatic language coming in here, where they're allowed to follow that path, where they're allowed to see other people fail and follow their paths and not be sanctioned for it, to allow that creativity to grow inside of a protected barrier, right? So the project management is really, really rigid and really structured, but project management should be, right? And it provides the scaffolding for that creativity to be allowed to grow. And I think that's the balance we need to constantly find, is to find a way to create a structured space that allows the creativity to sit in the middle without being judged by other people, supported, encouraged, all the rest of those things. I'll drive hard on trying to get them to do a great job, but not judged by me.
Excellent. I think that's a really wonderful way to think about creativity in education. And I'd really like to thank you for your time and for the conversation that we just had. I think in my head, I have a little more clarity about rhizomatic education, but it would be dangerous to say that it's all clear. And I'm sure that there's a lot more exploring.
Not all clear to me either, man.
Yeah.
That's the thing about this. Like, if anybody goes out there and does research on rhizomatic learning, you'll see a couple of things. You'll see that for 12 years, I've refused to define it.
Yeah.
Right. Because for me, rhizomatic learning, I hope to, in the ways in which I engage with the concept, I hope that other people can interpret it in ways that are slightly like them too. Right.
Yeah.
So I equally don't want it to be rich. It would seem strange if it was rigid and defined.
Exactly.
So, and so it's a constant learning process for me, and I hope it is the same for everybody else.
Yes. Thank you so much, Dave, and thank you for your time. Thank you.
Bye bye.